All right, so we have some folks joining, I think. So welcome to everyone who is joining. We have Bridget, Mary, and somebody on iPhone 3. And just want to welcome you. We're obviously, Dr. Curtin and I are just kind of chatting away here for a few minutes in advance of the meeting starting. So make yourself comfortable, get yourself a beverage. We'll start up soon. All right, I am going to go on mute here.
Uh, this will be the last section on the history of the Augustinian Order and Augustinian thought. I'm D.P. Curtin, and for the last three sections, we've been talking about where the Order of St. Augustine has come from and how it's evolved over the last 16 centuries. So, this final section will deal with the Augustinian Order during the high period of the Middle Ages, how it established some of its familiar philosophy and became more familiar to us than its medieval incarnation. Last time, we were discussing the foundations of the order, how different groups were brought together under a distinctive papal decree and collected to form a single united group. And this was all part of the broader mendicant movement taking place in medieval Europe, which revolutionized the church and gave rise to a number of familiar Catholic orders, such as the Dominicans and the Franciscans and Carmelites, and so on. I believe we left off with the question of Augustinian identity, how this new order would be framed, what its mission would be, and how it would be integrated into the larger Latin Church, which, when the order is created in all of its original documents, there's a lot of ambiguity to that. These groups are compiled, but there's no clear directive put behind it other than it's brought together under the name of Augustine and some of the rule of Augustine in terms of communal living. So I think it was the Woody Allen movie, Annie Hall, where he said that he took a speed reading course and read War and Peace in 20 minutes and then said it was about Russia. We might have to observe a little bit of a similar situation when talking about this idea of the scholia. The scholia is a vast idea, the compilation of all Augustinian philosophical thought. It's really not possible for me to be able to go into the full depth of it. So, for all intents and purposes, it's about Russia here. To be able to help define what the order was going to be, it was necessary to be able to create a centralized school of thought that was distinctively Augustinian. And also to give Augustine's body of work a little bit of a systematic framework. St. Augustine's one of the most prolific writers of the ancient world, and he left us a large number of texts. But it's really hard to be able to organize them in any way that we would have a clear and at times even a coherent school of thought. As you can imagine, for a man who spent 40 years of his life composing things, his thoughts sometimes drifted. Even towards the end of his life, he wrote a book called Retractions, where he points out all of the mistakes that he made along the way. During the high medieval period, there was a lot of interest in not only the ideas of Augustine, but the ideas associated with scholasticism. That's the conjunction of Christian teaching with the older ideas of Greek and Roman philosophy, and also the idea of systematic thought in general. So we see this famously in someone like St. Thomas Aquinas' work, Summa Theologica, where he tried taking the whole of Western theology and philosophy and organizing it in such a way that it would be a single coherent document. Clearly a very ambitious idea, one that he never fully realized, but that's very much in the zeitgeist of the time. For Augustinian thought in particular, this would involve a lot of familiar themes, which we see here. Ideas like grace and human nature and the primacy of human love. All of these things will appear again and again in Augustine's writing, but the Scholia was interested in trying to define them in a clear and orthodox way and to give them a sense of definition so that they could be articulated and eventually spread. So, I think grace is probably one of the most familiar themes that you see in Christian theology. And most people are vaguely familiar with the idea of grace, but maybe the philosophical challenge that's associated with grace isn't exactly clear. How does man do the will of God if the will of man is perverse? In some things like communication, this is known as the problem of feedback. How do I wipe the dirt off my hand using another dirty hand? For the Christian, they need God's grace, which is freely given by God to help human beings be some other way. And so within the Augustinian tradition, the primacy of grace stands at the very center of the Christian life. It affirms that every movement towards God's begins not with human strength, not with our own sense of will or agency, but in the merciful initiative of God himself. Drawing upon St. Augustine's struggle with Pelagianism, which is a heresy he's famously trying to debunk in the 5th century, the Augustinians taught that fallen humanity, which was wounded by sin, cannot attain salvation through their powers alone. Instead, grace precedes it, it has to awaken it, and ultimately it sustains every good act of the will. Divine grace illuminates the mind, it enables the soul to ultimately be able to love God and love God rightly, and in that very Augustinian sense, it's able to heal the heart. The emphasis on grace here doesn't destroy the idea of human freedom or free will or any sense of human agency, but it's intended to be able to restore it. In the Augustinian school, real liberty isn't found in autonomy from God, but in the joyful dependence upon him. Another one of the significant elements that comes into the Scholia is the notion of divine illumination, which stands really at the heart of all true knowledge, which affirms that the human mind can't attain wisdom apart from the light of God. And drawing from St. Augustine's conviction that Christ is what they call the interior teacher, the magisteria interior, the Augustinians taught that the intellect, which is capable of reasoning about creative things, but ultimately depends upon divine illumination to grasp eternal truths, especially things that are very abstract, ideas like justice and goodness and beauty. This teaching, again, it doesn't deny the natural powers that exist in the mind, but situate them within a participatory relationship with God, who is truth itself. So this is part of a broader conversationing at the time happening in Catholic circles about how to read Aristotle, who at the time was a very controversial figure. Aristotle posits that we can know things about the world just through our natural observations. And so the positions of Plato, who's more classically associated with Christianity, and Aristotle are probably best represented here in this famous fresco by Raphael, where Plato is pointing up to the heavens and Aristotle down at the earth. This is kind of the basis of their respective philosophies. How do we know things? Through observation of the earth and through the natural world, or through the unchanging eternal truths which are intended to be revealed to us? Augustine, in this sense, is very much interested in Plato. The issue is the Augustinians have to respond to a world where Aristotle is becoming very popular, and it requires an intellectual response to be able to know how to use him appropriately. So this other third element of the Scholia, the sovereignty of the will, which is for Augustine inseparable from the idea of the sovereignty of love, because the human being is ultimately shaped not only by what he knows, but what he loves. For Augustine, the idea of love comes up fairly frequently. It's a psychological need that he's keenly aware of. St. Augustine taught that the will is never neutral. It's drawn towards the object of its deepest affection, whether towards passing goods of the earthly city or towards things like eternal beauty in the form of God. So our will, our sense of freedom, doesn't consist of any kind of autonomous self-assertion. It's through healing and rightfully ordered directions, what we mentioned before of the Ordo Amoris, that will bring about the idea of grace. So sin disorders love and bends the will inwardly onto itself, which grace restores the soul in charity, enabling it to love God above all other things. In this vision, the Augustinian idea that the heart governs the person more profoundly than the intellect alone, which again isn't synonymous with Platonic thought or Platonic philosophy. It's something distinctive to the Augustinian school itself. The moral and spiritual life, ultimately, for the Augustinian school, becomes this sense of the continued struggle over the rightly ordered sense of love, the rightly ordered sense of desire. In this period, one of the more important figures is this of Thomas of Strasbourg, who was an Augustinian theologian, and later he would become one of the prior generals of the order. Thomas sought to defend the idea that the Augustinian school was fundamental to the broader church. His writings have this kind of careful balance between rigorous academic theology, but also the practical pastoral spirituality that's characteristic of the Augustinian order. When he was a teacher in Paris, he was a leader amongst the Augustinians, and he wanted to help consolidate the sense of kind of an authentic Augustinian theological identity, something that was distinctive for the order, that was separate from the other mendicant orders, which were also evolving and kind of developing their own style of spirituality, style of philosophy of the time. There was a lot of internal debate and intense debate with other mendicant groups about exactly what the boundaries of these groups would be, which would spill over into things like some of the great medieval debates, which we'll get into in a few minutes. Another significant figure, Augustinian friar of this period, a guy named Gregory of Rimini, he's often called the authentic doctor, the Doctor Authenticus. He stands as probably one of the great theologians of the period. He's a professor at the University of Paris, which is kind of ground zero for all European intellectual life during the High Middle Ages. Gregory combines some of the scholastic reasoning, some of these ideas from Greek philosophy, with a profound fidelity to the teachings of St. Augustine, especially concerning things like the fallen condition of humanity. You might talk about him as kind of a proto-psychologist in this sense. He wants to be able to place human nature somewhere specifically, and he's applying some of the sources that he has for that period. He emphasizes that salvation depends entirely upon the gratuitous grace that's given by God, again, rather than any kind of natural powers that exist within the human will. And this is an important element, that we can never really truly earn our salvation. It has to be given freely for the grace that God gives. Some of his lectures on the sentences of Peter Lombard become very highly influential during this period, kind of commentary upon commentary, a little bit of a prefiguration of the modern academic cycle of citations. Now in universities, we have citations of citations of citations, and so on. Gregory remains, for quite a few centuries after the fact, a great defender of some of the primary Augustinian convictions here, that the human heart is something to be explored, and just as it said in the beginning of Confessions, it really only finds rest through divine mercy and ultimately illumination. As I mentioned, some of the great medieval scholastic debates, which get fairly intense. This is a society without sports or any kind of real notion of entertainment. Even theater really doesn't exist in the form that we would recognize it now. So medieval debates are something that are heavily attended. The Augustinians occupy a very distinctive place within these great scholastic debates, which are taking place at the newly formed medieval universities, especially in dialogue and sometimes conflict with other groups like the Thomists and the Scotists and a group known as the Nominalists. If you're unfamiliar with these schools, that's completely understandable. Most people are not. The Thomists, that is to say, Thomism is the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas. It's sometimes associated with the Dominicans. Scotism is named after a guy named John Scotus, who places emphasis on the question of the will. And nominalism is something very strange. It claims that objects and ideas aren't real, that everything is ultimately a proposition. Not something that you would hear from the pulpit any kind of modern church. But at the time, this was considered very serious intellectual debate. And the Augustinians wanted to be able to engage with some of their peers, especially the Dominicans, especially talking about the reading and understanding of someone like Aristotle. In these medieval debates, the Augustinians emphasized things like divine illumination, the deep dependence of the human will upon God. That's to say, how do we know anything about the world itself? For someone like Aquinas, we can only know things, well, we can know things without knowing God. He starts Summa Theologica, his big work, with this proposition. For Augustine, and I suppose the Augustinians, this is a non-starter. Knowledge of the material world starts with knowledge of God. He's kind of the philosophical anchor point, which illuminates the intellect. To really be able to understand things about anything starts with a point of understanding truth, and what is truth illuminate from, but ultimately from God. The Augustinians also are challenged. They challenge some of the more optimistic anthropology of other Catholic schools, arguing that human beings couldn't attain anything good through their own natural powers. So things like divine illumination and grace certainly come to the forefront there. There is this reoccurring question of predestination, which really haunts any kind of reading of Augustine, because it's never really clear, and this comes up from the very beginning of Augustinian thought, well into the Reformation, where it's used by people like John Calvin to support all kinds of various hypotheses. A significant element within the Augustinian order in the 14th century is this idea of papal patronage. The Augustinians occupied a distinctive place within scholastic debates, but they're able to do so just because they're able to do so because they have support directly from the papacy. There's no question on their orthodoxy or what they're able to do or what they're able to say. And this is definitely fitting right now with the first Augustinian pope. But in the 14th century, the Augustinian order benefited significantly from this papal patronage, which helped elevate its intellectual and political influence across the church. Popes frequently entrusted the Augustinians with things like university chairs, where theology could be taught and be organized and be cleared to make sure that it was free from any sense of error. They were also considered very scholarly, so they were given things like diplomatic missions. They were given episcopal appointments as bishops and positions more broadly within the papal curia. This support strengthened the order's reputation as being distinctively learned and a loyal defender of papal authority. During this period, if you're unfamiliar with things like the papacy during the medieval period, there is a lot of chaos taking place, which I could probably extend to talking about for quite a while, but again, keeping it relatively short. Augustinian theologians of the period often emphasize themes that align closely with papal interests. So ideas like the unity of the church, and again, the necessity of grace, things like the authority of the papal office as a safeguard against schism, because the memory of the East-West schism in 1054 was still relatively fresh. They wanted to make sure that there was no sense of disorder that would come, and so the organization that's provided by the papacy being very fundamental. And this deeply shaped later Augustinian political theology by defending the hierarchical church authority and the supremacy of the Pope in spiritual matters, which will come to a head a few centuries later during the 16th century when we have the general chaos of the Peasants' Revolt and the Protestant Reformation. I think any group is not really impervious to the time that they live in. We can probably feel this ourselves in the era of COVID, where we're unable to really escape the events that were happening around us. The Black Death is perhaps the most infamous event of the 14th century. And for the Augustinians, it profoundly shaped late medieval Augustinian thought. Seeing as half of the population of Europe died, it deeply emphasized things like the idea of human frailty or the instability of earthly life. Both themes that we see played out a lot in things like City of God. At the time, in sermons and in other theological writings, Augustinians stressed interior repentance, the vanity of worldly ambition, the need for spiritual reform taking place amid a collapsing world, because there were certainly plenty of people at the time who believed that this was the end of the world. The Black Death, the plague itself, also intensified pastoral concerns. The Augustinians are ultimately directed towards the pastoral concerns of their community, and some of these communities were suffering quite considerably. Beyond doing things like encouraging devotion and penance, there was the very real material concern of how do you care for some of the urban sick. Some of the consequence of this is that we see a number of friars die during this period. In fact, the total number of friars within the order collapses in the middle of the 14th century here under the weight of the plague. The Augustinians were working within the cities where there was death, and there was a high tendency to be able to address the needs of the poorest. And the cities themselves, the urban centers in Europe, were ground zero for the Black Death. So the Augustinians were kind of front row center for this as it was unfolding. And so consequently, the mortality numbers were sky high throughout the 14th century, and after which, where the order is attempting to try to rebuild itself in the face of such a massive human disaster. In fact, the order almost entirely collapses after this period because of the loss of so many friars. In addition to that, as if the Black Death wasn't significant enough in terms of a hurdle, we also have what's known as the Western Schism. Most people are familiar with the East-West schism between the Catholic and the Orthodox world, which still has not been resolved 1,000 years later. But the Western Schism took place here, where there are two rival popes. For roughly about 40 years, the Pope in Rome and the Pope in Avignon in southern France. The Augustinian order found itself divided in obedience between these two rival claimants. And this was probably reflected in some of the broader challenges that you can see. You have a random assortment of countries in this map here. Scotland supports the Avignon Pope. However, England supports the Pope in Rome. To go in between these two territories is a little bit treacherous, especially if you were a friar between two rival popes. So many Augustinian theologians had to wrestle with this question of church authority, and especially the need for growing a reform within the church. Because as much as there was support for the papacy, there was also deep concern for questions of corruption and the growing political infiltration that was taking place on the highest levels of church government. Augustinian thinkers become increasingly concerned about the state of the church and argued that the visible disorder that the church currently had didn't negate the spiritual unity that existed. But this period deepens Augustinian concerns about the moral integrity of people like the clergy and how to repair some of the crumbling edifice of the medieval church, which at this point was very deeply troubling. The schism also pushed Augustinian scholars to reflect more intensely on the relationship between the papal authority they've been given and the spiritual health of the church in general. And this becomes at least a little bit of a quagmire going into the 15th century, which has its own specific challenges. So the figure on the left here is probably unknown to most people, but he's probably the single most important professor in the Western world, perhaps of all time. His name is Gestimus Platon, and he came from the collapsing Roman Empire, which you can see from this map. At the time, The Roman Empire in the middle of the 15th century is really little more than the city of Constantinople and a little fraction of what is now modern Greece. He had come to Italy to attend the Council of Florence, which was intending to be able to resolve the Catholic Orthodox split. But his appearance in Florence was something akin to the Beatles appearing on Ed Sullivan. It's a massive cultural moment that really sparked the broader event that we now call the Renaissance, the rebirth. It's the rediscovery of the classic ancient past, especially Greek and Latin writers, because Plato is bringing these writers with him. He's lecturing in Florence. Every modern professor can trace his academic lineage back to Plato, which is no small accomplishment. Platon reintroduces Plato to the Latin West and indirectly influences the Augustinian reform taking place. He is interested in the revival of this Platonic spirituality, with the emphasis on the soul's ascent toward divine truth, which famously had impacted Augustine in his own life. But they're going back to the original source, partially to Augustine himself, but also to the sources that impacted Augustine, which had been clouded after several centuries for various other reasons. Platon himself was not an Augustinian, but at the time he promoted ideas and views that were at least partially under suspicion by the rest of the Latin Church. So his exaltation of Plato, while it resonated with the Augustinians, there had to be a sense of a little bit of distance to make sure that they didn't run afoul of any kind of church authority. Augustinian reformers at this period become something known as humanists. And this is a different idea from our modern conception of humanism. A humanist is someone who's interested in the humanities, in the ideas of literature and philosophy, and being able to really understand our humanity through some of the primary cultural documents that have existed over our collective history. And this was especially true in places like Italy, where the Renaissance was flourishing. They found a renewed interest in the ideas of interiority, the inner life, in contemplation, and the soul's participation in divine wisdom. All of these things came together through the Renaissance recovery of some of these Platonic texts. The figures that were associated in the Augustinian world were figures who wanted to be able to take some of the ideas that had been collected by the order, especially ideas associated with scholasticism, being able to read Aristotle, but also the sense of spiritual reform through some of these Platonic thoughts that had been otherwise relatively derelict. And some of this also includes a return to some of the learning of the ancient church fathers, most of whom wrote in Greek, and we didn't really have exposure to just as a matter of language barriers, that during the Renaissance we're able to be reintroduced to because the Greek texts were being transmitted at this twilight of the Roman Empire. In the face of humanism, and in the face of the Renaissance, we see two things happening, two separate reform movements taking place. The Italian observant Augustinian reform movement of the 15th century emerges as part of a wider reform in the medieval religious life, seeking to be able to return to some of the stricter disciplines that had existed because of things like the schism, the Black Death, a general sense of spiritual malaise that just comes with institutions with time. The disciplines of poverty and prayer and fidelity to the rule of St. Augustine had become a little bit on the lax side. So it was influenced by some of the spiritual renewal movements that were spreading across Italy at that time. Movements that wanted to see the renewal of the church, trying to bring things back and return them, especially in the light of things like Renaissance humanism. The observant Augustinians were very critical of some of the laxity and especially some of the worldliness that they believed had entered in the convents and priories at the time, where the interest was in political power, in being able to be associated with some particularly powerful duke or emperor, and less on some of the spiritual domain that you would associate with a convent or a priory. Some of these Augustinian reformers also associated the movement. They had stressed the primacy of charity and some of the restlessness that's associated with the longing for God, themes that are deeply rooted in the ideas of Augustinian anthropology and spirituality. But again, if you're interested in material matters, questions of how do I be better connected to local powers that be, they tend to fall by the wayside. The Italian movement, or I should say the Italian Reform movement, really wanted to return to some of its mendicant roots. The ideas of encouraging preaching, of studying, of pastoral engagement, helping people prepare for the intellectual and spiritual climate that was very much of the age. They wanted to be able to take the application not only of Augustinian thought, but of the Augustinian tradition, and be able to apply it to their own age through things like prayer and mysticism, and again, that old monastic sense of solitude. And they weren't the only ones to be able to try to push for that. Beyond the Italians was also their pairing. So these Germans, the German Reform movement, the German observant Reform movement, it took place in a similar way that you would expect to the one taking place in Italy, with a stricter sense of discipline, of communal reform, returning to some of the ideals that were put forward by St. Augustine in some of his works, and in building his own community in Tagaste and later Hippo Regius. This was emerging in response again with questions of laxity in many religious houses, and after the parade of crises that took place in the late Middle Ages, the two of which we'd mentioned, but Germany saw its own issues with the battle between the papacy and the emperor, which set some of the mood for this as well, where there's effectively a spiritual no man's land developing. The German observant Augustinians drew heavily on Augustine's theology of grace, humanity's dependent upon divine mercy, which is something that had been previously emphasized, but they give it a new state of kind of centrality. This question of grace is really going to come up and be fundamental as this movement moves along. Their spirituality stressed a sense of inwardness, transformation of the soul through union with God rather than through any kind of external sense of observances. So this would stand in contrast to more ritualized observances taking place in things like parochial churches, which is perhaps maybe a little bit more sacramental. For the German observant Augustinians, grace is a little bit more abstract. It's not something that is directly given in a way that you might receive grace from the sacraments. At the same time, the German observant Augustinians, the movement is very strongly tied to university scholarship, especially in German cities like Erfurt and Wittenberg, which is helping create this kind of new intellectual atmosphere with deep concerns about the question of exactly what human nature is. Because Augustine, there's quite a large body of his writing that questions this. So much so that issues like original sin are built around this perversity that exists in human nature. It's probably for this reason and the emphasis on the study of human nature that the German universities would spawn this new word that has an application to us today, psychology. The first use of the word comes out of it here a little bit later in the 16th century, but it's built upon this Augustinian question of human nature. And the Lutheran Reformation, which would directly follow this, is being considered to be an extension to some degree of the German Augustinian reform, just one that went off the rails for separate political reasons. But a large number of the ideas of this reform would be played out later with Luther himself. So we move towards the tail end of the 15th century. We have another significant Augustinian who will help forge the lasting identity of the order, and that's Giles of Viterbo. He's an Augustinian reformer, a long line of Augustinian reformers, and ultimately later a cardinal. He helped the Augustinian vision of renewal become grounded again in ideas of interconversion, of divine illumination, and importantly, the ideas of harmony between faith and learning. The universities, while they're coming out of the church, they still struggle with this question of secular knowledge and its pairing with divine illumination. Giles saw growing challenges, we can call them, in the institution of the church, and sought to alter things on an interpersonal level. He argued that the true reforms of the church, they don't begin with the institution alone, but with the transformation of the human heart. They begin on a very personal level that it's impossible to avoid. That if you don't change people on the individual basis, it doesn't matter what the institution is. At the opening of the Fifth Lateran Council in 1512, he famously declared that men must be changed by religion and not religion by men, thus expressing this belief that spiritual decay arises out of moral corruption rather than deficits in doctrines themselves. And this is significant because the Fifth Lateran Council, while its intention was originally put towards the reformation of the church, it got bogged down on all of these really esoteric philosophical issues. I think some of the canons of it talk about the natural immortality of the soul in the light of Christological revelation, which for most people is word salad. Trying to be able to address the practical needs of the congregation and the church as a whole needs, rather than kind of going too deeply into the intellectual life. For Giles, he also thought uniting Renaissance humanism with Augustinian theology would be a tremendous way of strengthening the church, of being able to take the literature that people are reading, I guess the media of its own day, and being able to pair it with Augustinian thought. So as a result, he valued classical learning, and he thought things like Hebrew studies, which was considered very novel at the time, was going to be a great way of being able to incorporate that. He always subordinated all wisdom into the idea of the contemplation of God, and ultimately this question of the restoration of Christian unity, which the church of the 15th century, still reeling from a schism that had been fixed, but was still fairly shaky, was something that he really strongly wanted to emphasize. Giles, he stressed the centrality of grace, an important concept not only towards human psychology, but also practically. He stressed that the soul's ascent towards God and the providential rule of God in history. That's to say that God is the God of history, that he ultimately is guiding and directing the unfolding of the church across time. And if God wants to be able to reform the church, he will. That requires something beyond any sense of human effort. Going into that, probably worth talking about this last and very salient figure here. And his name is Johann von Staupitz. He's probably one of the most significant figures in the Augustinian Order in the late 15th century. Some people remember specifically his German association. For me, it seems to be pretty straightforward because every picture of him I've ever seen, he looks like Sergeant Schultz from Hogan's Heroes. Von Staupitz is the vicar general of the German Augustinians at the time, and he's a mentor towards Martin Luther. And he represents a deeply pastoral and at times mystical current that exists within the late medieval Augustinian thought. Most of his surviving writings place emphasis on divine grace, again, on the sense of interiority, of psychological evaluation, and the soul's dependence on God. Staupitz, he stressed the limitations of human effort in attaining salvation, which again is in the same strain as the long line of Augustinian reformers, that we can't earn our salvation on our own. It has to be given to us. Ergo, we need to be able to observe things like patience and humility and all of the Christian virtues that you would expect. Unlike some of the more rigid scholastic tendencies, his theology emphasizes the transformation of the heart through God's love rather than any kind of external observance, and even against any kind of intellectual speculation. While von Staupitz is a university professor, he's his doctorate in theology certainly a very pivotal figure in the life of the 16th century. He, like Aquinas, sees it as being all straw in the end. He wants to be able to direct some things of troubled consciences away from the ideas of despair towards a sense of confidence, which is going to be very salient considering one of his pupils here. Some of the themes that we would see in reading someone like von Staupitz will shape some of Luther's early religious developments. But to a certain degree, he also becomes a little bit of a harbinger of the Protestant Reformation. While Staupitz saw the need for reform within the church, like all the previous reformers within the Augustinian order, he believed that Luther took the ideas that had been placed by Augustinians too far and had taken too far harsh of an anthropology. Staupitz would be the one who would remove Luther as a friar and eventually cut ties with him. But at the same time, he's not condemning Luther. He's not trying to attack him on any personal basis. The two men knew each other very well. He's trying to prevent some of the rising tensions that are existing, because the need for reform within the church was very obvious. It's just that the Reformation, taking things like the Peasants' Revolt and Luther's compounding ideas, began to make even the most friendly Augustinians extremely nervous. He seems to have hoped that this would have remained an internal conflict, that some of the questions of Luther regarding the questions of grace could be convened through a church council or a local synod to be addressed internally, as it had been in the past, even in Luther's attempt to nail the thesis to the Wittenberg Cathedral doors. This is a common academic question. If there's going to be a great debate that's taking place, as there have been great debates within the Augustinian order for centuries, this is how it starts. Significantly, von Staupitz remains loyal to the Catholic Church and understood reform primarily as the renewal of the authentic Augustinian spirituality within the ecclesiastical order that existed. And so he becomes an influential member of trying to moderate Augustinian thought at this point. But as we enter into 1517, Europe descends into a state of chaos. There's a certain sense where the Reformation that's taking place becomes commentary on not only like Augustinian thought, but also how it's going to be applied. Distinctively, Luther and his fellow reformers are all heavily influenced by Augustine, but none of them can quite agree upon exactly what that looks like in terms of creating a sense of reform. And as we go into the 16th century, the Augustinian order goes about its own sense of reformation, along with the broader counter-reformation taking place at the time. And there are other groups that have broken away from the OSA that remain distinctive, separate Augustinian orders that are removed, but have found their own sense of reformation, at least in terms of the reading of the rule of St. Augustine. So this is a distinctive turning point for the Augustinian order. We see the sense of spiritual renewal taking place and the intellectual development getting a significant growth within the universities themselves. But there's also an institutional strain that's coming out of the Protestant Reformation, and it becomes a question of exactly what to do about it. The Augustinian order has to be able to respond to these questions, and they do so by trying to rein in some of the practices taking place in the universities, trying to be able to establish a clear sense of the limit of the question of grace, and even in questions of anthropology. That yes, we as human beings do have a fallen nature, but that doesn't create a sense of total deprivation, to use John Calvin's language. That there is a sense of goodness within us that can be spawned. It's a question of being able to look at that in further depth. And I'd love to be able to continue how this developed into the 16th century, but we probably need about 4 sections just to be able to do the first 10 years of that, because all of these conversations are the grammar of the Reformation. How does grace work? How does what they call sacramental efficacy play out? I'm probably not the best person to be able to respond to those kinds of questions, but those do kind of lead into what is the ending of the medieval church and the beginning of the modern church as we know it, and culminating in things like the Council of Trent at the end of the 16th century. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. That's all I have for tonight. I think we can open things up for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Curtin. As always, I'll kick off with a question. I was intrigued by what you were saying with regard to the Augustinians being deliberate about providing some type of a, I guess I'll call it like a counterweight to Thomism and Scotism. So obviously that would be the Dominicans, I think the Franciscans. And so was there sort of like a mendicant rivalry, or was it legitimately a search for truth from within each theology? Yeah, sure, for lack of a better word, theology.
Well, yeah, so there's definitely a mendicant rivalry. It doesn't really exist in the world today. Like, we don't think of it like, oh yeah, Franciscans and Dominicans, they're gonna butt heads. There was certainly a sense of territoriality to it. Like certain cities, certain neighborhoods in major European cities were distinctively regarded by their mendicant order. It's not a perfect analogy, but we might consider it similar to like sports teams today. Like you're clearly affiliated with the Augustinians, the White Friars, the Black Friars. They have different schools of theology. None of them are what they would call heterodox. They're not heretical. These are open questions. How do we know things about God? How do we interpret the text of scriptures accurately? Aquinas lays out a beautiful document in Summa Theologica, but there are certainly points where he's not even necessarily clear. And if anyone who's ever read it, there's a certain headache-inducing quality to it, which is point, 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 quotation, counterpoint, 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 and here's what I think. And it goes on like that for multiple sections. This is a society that's really interested in the world of debate, that's kind of able to, for the first time in 1,000 years, play with ideas. And so different schools of thought kind of place different emphasis on where they want to be able to play with those ideas. For the Augustinians, I mentioned that the term psychology doesn't exist until the 16th century, but that's very much the case. Augustine is very much a proto-psychologist in some of his approach and orientation to the world. And this is different from an approach like Francis. Francis and the Franciscans don't place that kind of heavy intellectual focus. There are certain ones that are very interested in how to be able to read Aristotle, and they take that in a different direction. Famously, you have the father of chemistry, Francis Bacon, a Franciscan friar who wants to be able to take Aristotle and apply it to the practical world that he lives in. How do we be able to address some of these questions that relate to peasant life in Italy in the 13th century? Some of this is just a question of orientation and what they're responding to.
Yeah, thank you. I always kind of thought it was just basically you could maybe boil it down to the difference that like Augustine at his foundation was a pastor, and Aquinas at his foundation was a scholar, and the orders sort of adopted that, to some degree, and probably still to this day, but that's maybe just my take. Oh, so two questions that we have. One from Eileen, thank you so much. And please comment on the ongoing process of developing a religious philosophy. The process is still ongoing. Yes, question mark. I'm not sure if that gives you enough to go on, Dr. Curtin, or maybe we need Eileen to specify a little bit more what's going on there.
Let me see if I can read the question here. Thank you. Become a process of developing a religious philosophy. The process is still ongoing. So, texts are not necessarily clear. So anytime you read a text, you're ultimately interpreting it. And the challenge is, how do you want to interpret it? So in the realm of things like jurisprudence, how do you read a law? There are things like textualism, where we're going to read exactly what it says, and exactly what it says is the inherent meaning. And there are things in jurisprudence like purposism, where the purpose, the intent of the law is important, and the exact verbatim phrasing is not. When it comes to being able to create a sense of kind of coherent religious philosophy for Augustine and Augustinian thought, we're dealing with a large body of texts. So we need to know how to be able to incorporate them. And it's Eileen? I'm reading that?
Yes.
Yes. Trying to be able to take all of these texts and compile them in a way requires a lot of scholarship. And you're right, that is something that's going to be ongoing. Even today, there's a question of exactly what did Augustine mean by this? How do we take Augustine in the context of one work and read him with another? Certainly, City of God is this massive text. Do we take everything in a certain sense ex cathedra, or can we read Augustine in a way that's going to be purposeful, where we're able to understand that his evolution of thought evolves? Is it better to be able to trust the young Augustine, who says things like, in the Garden of Eden, everyone was a Christian because Christianity was something that existed from the beginning of time? Or the older Augustine, who says outside of the church there is no salvation? Some of the discussion that has to exist within the church and within the Augustinian order is how to make sense of all these documents. So it does require a sense of developing a continual sense of study and looking into creating a coherent sense of religious philosophy, which is why these universities exist today, right? We're continuing to study these things. It's not like we're one and done. It's something that requires continual debate and renewal.
Thank you. Let's see, we have a couple. The next one is from Jackie. Did Martin Luther form some version of the Augustinian order after separating from the Catholic Church? So are there Lutheran Augustinians, I guess would be the part of the question from Jackie.
So my understanding is that Lutheran theology is heavily Augustinian, and even some of the images of things like the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Germany, they'll draw upon some of the themes and imagery of the Augustinian order. One of the things that Lutheranism was very adamant about doing was the dissolution of monasteries. They didn't think that there should be a separation between the clergy and the common people in this sense. So there's no continuity of the Augustinian order within Lutheranism. Now, within the Protestant world, while Henry VIII dissolved monasteries in his realm in Ireland and England, they did reestablish the Augustinian order within the Anglican Church in the 19th century, which is at least somewhat confusing, because if part of the reason why you separated from Rome was the dissolution of monasteries, why did you establish monasteries 300 years later? That does exist. In fact, across the street from the old Augustinian friary in Adair, Ireland, is a new Augustinian Anglican monastery that I believe is still in common use.
Okay, thank you. And from Angie, oh, my list is moving around here. Was there a rivalry between the various Augustinians similar to what happened to the Franciscans in terms of like reform movements within the order?
I don't know if I'd use the word rivalry, but there's clearly a question of exactly what to do about it. The problems that existed in terms of discipline within monasticism and discipline within the broader church was definitely a problem. Everyone saw it into the 15th and going into the Protestant Reformation. It's just that there wasn't a clear purpose on exactly what that's going to look like. So we know we need to be able to clean house. Within the Augustinian order, these are the two primary reformations taking place. There are smaller ones, but the Italians didn't want to place the emphasis on places like the universities, where Germany, the Augustinians were almost synonymous with the universities. They were deeply tied to it, and Luther himself, being a university professor, was pretty salient in that sense. I'm not familiar so much with the history of the Franciscans. I do know that they're heavily fractured, but I think Franciscan fracturing goes back to the beginning after Francis died with what was his name, Giocondo, Bernardo de Quintavarne. a lot of Italian names, which I probably am not pronouncing correctly.
All right. I think, folks, that will be a wrap for today. So going once. I want to again thank you so much, Dr. Curtin. This has been great with a capital G and an exclamation point at the end. So thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining. And please stay tuned for updates on upcoming programming. And I wish you all a peaceful rest of the night. God bless you. And thanks. Goodbye.